On a quiet Sunday morning in the coastal province of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, the congregation of a small church gathered for their weekly service. The atmosphere was calm, filled with the soft murmur of voices and the distant harmony of a choir rehearsing before the sermon. Among the members of that choir was a young man known to everyone simply as Joseph Molete. He sang, he attended Bible study sessions, and he lived modestly within the church grounds. To those around him, Joseph appeared gentle, disciplined, and devoted. He was the kind of person who passed unnoticed because nothing about him seemed unusual. That illusion ended abruptly when several officers arrived at the church without warning, moved past startled worshipers, and walked directly toward Joseph's residence. The choir members watched in disbelief as he was handcuffed and escorted outside. A few attempted to intervene, insisting that a mistake had been made. Yet the officers remained firm. They had not come for Joseph Molete. They had come for a fugitive whose name had haunted two nations for more than 2 years. Lelo Holo Scott. The man standing in handcuffs was not a soft-spoken church volunteer. According to investigators, he was a double homicide suspect, a convicted killer who had escaped from a Lesotho prison under highly suspicious circumstances. His crimes were not ordinary acts of violence. They involved the dismemberment of 2 young victims, the concealment of their remains across multiple locations, and evidence that suggested ritualistic or predatory motives. For months, both Lesotho and South Africa had tightened borders, issued public warnings, and cooperated with international agencies as the search widened. The idea that this same individual had been living freely under a fabricated identity, singing hymns in a choir, was almost too surreal to accept. To understand how he reached that church in 2014, we must go back to the early months of 2012, when the disappearance of a 13-year-old boy marked the beginning of a series of crimes that horrified communities and exposed critical gaps in the region's justice system. It began with a missing schoolboy who never returned home. It escalated with the revelation of a body that had been mutilated, buried, and separated into pieces. And it deepened further when a university student vanished under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind contradictory messages, an unfamiliar visitor, and a trail of evidence that pointed to a single individual. These events forced authorities to confront a disturbing truth. Some perpetrators do not fit the familiar profile of violent offenders. They do not always appear threatening, isolated, or visibly unbalanced. Sometimes they exist within ordinary spaces, shielded by community trust, quietly reshaping themselves into versions that conceal who they truly are. If you appreciate detailed, evidence-based true crime storytelling told with respect for the victims and an emphasis on justice, consider subscribing to the channel as we examine one of the most unsettling cases in Southern Africa. When 13-year-old Moholobela Sesa failed to return home from school on January 11, 2012, his family reacted with immediate alarm. He was known as a dependable child, one who followed routine without deviation. His absence was entirely out of character. Relatives searched the footpaths leading from the Methodist church school, questioning neighbors and friends. Several villagers reported seeing him riding his bicycle near a narrow ravine at the edge of the settlement. It was a place where children occasionally played, but where adults rarely lingered. The terrain was uneven, filled with thick brush and known for sudden drop-offs. By evening, the search had expanded beyond what the family could manage alone. Local residents joined with handheld lanterns and makeshift torches, combing the forested slopes and rocky crevices. The police arrived shortly afterward, but their resources were limited, and the landscape worked against them. Hours of searching produced nothing except growing anxiety. The following morning, Moholobela's bicycle was found abandoned near the ravine. The discovery confirmed that something far more serious than a simple disappearance had occurred. For 4 days, the search continued without progress. Then, on January 15th, a villager noticed disturbed soil near a cluster of rocks resembling a hastily constructed grave. Authorities were summoned and officers began to dig. After nearly an hour of excavation, their shovels struck something solid. What emerged was not a complete body, but a headless torso, mutilated in ways that officers would later describe as among the most disturbing scenes of their careers. The chest cavity had been opened, the heart removed entirely. The arms and legs had been severed at the joints. Several of these missing parts were discovered later that same afternoon inside plastic bags buried in a second pit nearby. Forensic examination and DNA testing would ultimately confirm what the family already feared. The remains belonged to young Moholobela. The violence inflicted on the boy was not random. The cuts were precise, deliberate, and methodical. For investigators familiar with regional crime patterns, the mutilation bore unsettling similarities to ritualistic killings documented in parts of southern Africa. These rituals, often rooted in distorted interpretations of traditional practices, were typically carried out in secret and involved the harvesting of body parts believed to possess spiritual power. Although such acts were strongly condemned by modern communities, occasional incidents still surfaced, and each one left deep wounds in public consciousness. News of the murder spread rapidly across the village. Residents gathered for an emergency community meeting, but fear soon escalated into anger. A rumor circulated that a local businessman might be responsible. He had been the subject of previous mistrust, although none of the allegations against him had ever been substantiated. Fueled by grief and outrage, dozens of villagers marched to his home, throwing stones and attempting to break in Sintha. His windows shattered, and flames were briefly visible near the entrance before police forces intervened, dispersing the crowd and escorting the man to the station for his protection. Although he was later cleared of involvement, the incident revealed a growing tension between the community and the authorities. Villagers accused the police of incompetence and negligence, claiming they had failed to protect their children. Police leadership maintained that they were doing all they could, but privately, investigators admitted they had almost no usable evidence. The killer had left behind no identifiable footprints, no weapon, and no witnesses. Without additional clues, the case was at risk of becoming another unresolved tragedy. For months, the investigation moved slowly. Detectives revisited the crime scene repeatedly, hoping environmental changes might reveal previously unseen evidence. They interviewed traditional healers, local leaders, and anyone rumored to have participated in ritual practices, yet no meaningful lead surfaced. Some officers speculated that the murder could have been committed by a transient outsider who had already left the area. Others believed the killer was someone local who understood the ravine's geography well enough to avoid detection. The grief within Moholobela's family was immeasurable. His father, overcome with despair, asked repeatedly why anyone would harm a child who had never wronged anyone. Community members held vigils and organized marches calling for justice, but months passed with no progress. The case slowly began to fade from public discourse, overshadowed by daily concerns and the belief that the perpetrator had vanished without a trace. It would take another disappearance, one that occurred nearly 6 months later, to reopen the wounds of January and reveal that the horror had not ended. On July 10, 2012, Camelo Moha, a 19-year-old university student, did not return home after class. His younger brother received a message claiming that Camelo had decided to travel to Johannesburg. The message made little sense. His passport remained at home, and he had no travel plans. Soon after, a stranger appeared at the family residence asking for him. Then the stranger returned, again and again, each time with vague explanations. His name, he claimed, was Lelo Holo. When Camelo's belongings were found abandoned and anonymous calls reached the police, suspicion intensified. And when investigators searched Lelo's home, they discovered items that turned the unresolved case of Moholobela into something far more sinister. Inside a vehicle parked outside, officers found blood-stained clothing. Beneath the seat lay a severed organ. Wrapped in plastic bags stored in the back were human limbs. The same pattern of dismemberment used in Moholobela's murder had reappeared. Further excavation at sites indicated by Lelo revealed additional remains belonging to Camelo, including vital organs that appeared to have been partially removed or tampered with. The similarities between the two cases were undeniable. Both victims had disappeared under ordinary circumstances, both had been mutilated in a shockingly similar manner, and both sets of remains had been buried or concealed in remote locations accessible only to someone familiar with the area. For investigators, a chilling realization formed. The same hand had committed both murders. And the evidence pointed directly to one individual. The suspect now in custody was not an unknown drifter, not a ritual practitioner, and not a misunderstood businessman. He was a 25-year-old man who lived quietly among neighbors, attended school, and maintained the appearance of an unremarkable young adult, Lelo Holo Scott. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that nothing about him was ordinary. Everything that followed, his arrest, his mother's involvement, his spectacular prison escape, and his reinvention under a different identity, would expose failures within the justice system and terrify communities across two nations. To understand how the case escalated from a local tragedy to an international manhunt, we must examine the events that followed Lelo's initial arrest. The arrest of Lelo Holo Scott marked a turning point in a case that had already shaken the nation. After months of uncertainty surrounding Moholobela's death, the evidence now laid out before investigators was overwhelming. The brutality inflicted on both victims was shockingly consistent, and the physical items recovered left little room for speculation. But the deeper the police searched, the more disturbing the picture became. Inside Lelo's green Kroska pickup truck, investigators found clothing stained with fresh blood, a pair of athletic garments soaked through at the sleeves, and beneath the driver's seat, a severed organ, an unmistakable sign that the killings were not impulsive acts but carefully orchestrated crimes. Wrapped in a large black plastic bag, officers discovered a human arm and a severed leg. The level of decomposition indicated that the remains belonged to Camelo Moha, who had disappeared only days earlier. More discoveries followed as investigators probed deeper. Inside a pit latrine at a local primary school, guided by Lelo himself, officers retrieved 2 plastic bags. One contained internal organs, including a liver with a section cleanly removed and a heart missing an entire portion. The second bag contained 2 hands and 2 feet. Nearby, buried deeper and concealed beneath broken concrete slabs, officers unearthed a severed head and a human leg, both in an advanced state of decomposition. The head was later identified as Camelo's. The similarities between Camelo's mutilation and the earlier killing of Moholobela were undeniable. Both victims had been dismembered with alarming precision. Both had been partially disemboweled, and both had their remains hidden across multiple locations, suggesting deliberate planning rather than a spontaneous eruption of violence. Investigators concluded that the same individual was responsible, and Lelo's movements, possessions, and statements placed him firmly at the center of the crimes. As officers searched Lelo's home, they encountered additional signs of violence. In a cluttered storage room behind his residence, they found a blood-stained board, a roll of duct tape, a serrated saw, and a black sweater bearing Camelo's school emblem. There were also clothing items that Lelo claimed belonged to Moholobela. His explanations became increasingly inconsistent, shifting from hesitant justification to outright denial. More troubling still was the involvement of his mother, Ma Lelo Scott. Although she initially denied any knowledge of the crimes, officers discovered that her clothing had traces of blood consistent with the victims. She eventually admitted that she assisted in cleaning parts of the crime scene, yet insisted she did so under duress. Her story remained inconsistent, wavering between self-preservation and attempts to shield her son. When police escorted Lelo into custody, the reaction from the local community was immediate and explosive. News of the recovered remains spread across Maseru and beyond, igniting anger, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal. This was not an outsider. This was not a mysterious ritual practitioner wandering from village to village. This was a young man who lived among them, attended local schools, worshipped at neighborhood churches, and presented himself as an ordinary citizen. Crowds gathered outside the police station, demanding justice and calling for accountability from authorities. Residents accused the police of negligence, claiming that Moholobela's case should have been solved earlier and that Camelo's death could have been prevented. When it became public knowledge that May Lelo was also under investigation, tensions escalated further. Protesters surrounded her home, hurling stones and threatening to burn the property to the ground. Police intervened again, escorting both mother and son into protective custody. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the judicial process unfolded in a manner that only fueled public outrage. On September 22nd, both Lelo and his mother were granted bail, a decision that baffled and enraged citizens across the region. The very idea that an individual suspected of 2 ritualistic killings and possession of human remains could be released pending trial seemed unthinkable. Families of the victims expressed fear, insisting that their community was unsafe as long as the suspects were free. Authorities defended their actions by citing procedural requirements and guarantees of due process. But in the months that followed, their decision would prove disastrously misguided. On October 14, 2012, just before dawn, a correctional officer conducting a routine head count at Maseru Central Prison noticed something unsettling. Lelo's cell was empty. The door remained locked, undamaged, and the bars showed no signs of tampering. Confusion quickly descended into panic. Investigators swarmed the facility, piecing together the events that led to one of the most embarrassing security breaches in the nation's recent history. Near the window of his cell, officers discovered traces of petroleum jelly smeared across the bars. A small open container lay discarded on the floor. The theory was disturbingly simple. Lelo had lubricated his body, squeezed through the narrow steel bars, and dropped down onto the exterior roof. Fingerprints coated in petroleum jelly were found along the edge, supporting the conclusion. What remained unclear was how he had crossed the prison yard, escaped the perimeter fence, and disappeared without being seen by any guard. The likelihood of inside assistance was high, perhaps even obvious. 8 prison officers were suspended, and 6 later filed lawsuits claiming defamation and wrongful punishment. But public distrust only deepened. If a man accused of such horrific crimes could escape so easily, then the nation's justice system appeared profoundly unstable. Lelo's escape transformed him from a local suspect into a fugitive of international concern. Lesotho issued a nationwide alert, followed by a red notice through Interpol. A reward of 60,000 loti was offered for information leading to his capture. Roadblocks were established across border regions, and officers coordinated with South African authorities to track potential movements. Rumors circulated wildly. Some claimed he had fled deep into rural mountains. Others believed he had joined criminal networks in Johannesburg. There were even claims that he had disguised himself and was living among religious communities under an assumed identity. Those rumors would later prove chillingly accurate. While the government of Lesotho struggled to regain public trust, Lelo was building a new life in South Africa. Under the name Joseph Molete, he began attending a local church, joined the choir, and participated in community outreach activities. His demeanor was quiet and polite, and he seldom drew attention to himself. To those who met him, he appeared to be a gentle young man devoted to music and education. He even enrolled in a computer studies program in Durban, investing time into what appeared to be a stable future. The transformation was so effective that when South African authorities finally located him, many members of the church attempted to prevent officers from detaining him, insisting that there must be some mistake. But fingerprints, background checks, and facial matches told the truth. Joseph Molete did not exist. He was Lelo Holo Scott. His extradition triggered a year-long legal battle marked by fabricated documents, invented family histories, and an elaborate narrative in which he insisted he was a South African citizen. He presented scholarship certificates, identity documents, and witness statements, all of which were later proven fraudulent. His story shifted constantly. He claimed that government officials were framing him. He claimed that he had never been to Lesotho. He claimed that the records from his primary school in Maseru had been falsified. Every assertion was disproven. When the court finally ruled that Lelo was indeed a citizen of Lesotho, he was extradited under the condition that he would not face capital punishment. He returned to the country he had fled 2 years earlier, escorted by armed officers and surrounded by unprecedented security. The trial that followed was chaotic, prolonged, and punctuated by extraordinary claims. Lelo alleged torture, poisoning, and kidnapping. He accused police of planting evidence, forcing confessions, and threatening his mother. His statements grew increasingly erratic, at times bordering on delusional. His mother repeated portions of his testimony, insisting that officers had framed them both. Yet the physical evidence remained overwhelming. The remains buried in the ravine, the organs in the pit latrine, the blood-stained saw and duct tape, the clothing items, and the testimony of numerous witnesses all pointed to one conclusion. Despite years of legal delays, disruptions, and appeals, the truth could not be obscured. When the verdict finally arrived on June 23, 2020, it marked the end of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the region's history. Lelo Holo Scott received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 5 years for escaping custody. His mother, Ma Lelo, received a 10-year sentence with 3 years suspended. The court's judgment closed a dark chapter, but it did not erase the profound trauma inflicted on 2 families or the fear that gripped a community for years. The motives behind the killings remain unknown. Whether rooted in psychosis, ritualistic ideology, or pure cruelty, the crimes left scars that time may never fully heal. The case of Lelo Holo Scott did not end with the courtroom verdict. In truth, the trial illuminated only a fragment of the forces that shaped the investigation, the public reaction, and the broader failures of multiple systems that allowed a serial offender to operate undetected for so long. As the court documents became public and testimonies were reviewed in detail, the case began to reveal a web of dysfunction, fear, and institutional breakdown that extended across borders. Investigators who worked on the case stated that the killings were not random and not impulsive. They reflected a pattern of compulsion, secrecy, and emotional detachment that suggested a profound psychological disturbance. Yet the absence of a clear ritual pattern, combined with Lelo's inconsistent statements, left experts hesitant to attribute the crimes to any single motive. What remained evident was that the mutilation of both victims displayed a level of anatomical familiarity that went far beyond the instinctive violence of a typical assault. Forensic analysts emphasized the careful cutting of organs, the deliberate separation of limbs, and the methodical distribution of remains. These were not chaotic acts performed in panic. They indicated planning, physical control, and a willingness to revisit the crime scenes multiple times. Such behavior often reflects a desire to retain dominance over victims even after death, a psychological imprint found in certain categories of violent offenders. but the court did not establish a definitive motive. The possibility of ritual sacrifice was raised early, particularly because such crimes had occurred historically in some regions of southern Africa. However, nothing in Lelo's personal life, belongings, or digital history indicated involvement in ritualistic groups. His family did not practice such customs, and no witnesses described him participating in spiritual ceremonies that could explain the killings. Another theory proposed by forensic psychologists pointed to narcissistic entitlement and a pathological need for control. The fact that both victims were young males, one only 13 years old, suggested that vulnerability played a role in offender selection. Both victims could be overpowered easily. Both lived in areas Lelo knew intimately, and both could be targeted without drawing immediate suspicion. But even these explanations lacked completeness. Lelo's personality, as described by acquaintances, was paradoxical. Some recalled a quiet young man who seldom raised his voice. Others spoke of a volatile temper, a tendency to isolate himself, and a fascination with the occult. His academic background was unremarkable, but he demonstrated above-average intelligence when interacting with authorities. His ability to fabricate documents, construct alternate identities, and manipulate digital systems demonstrated cognitive planning not often observed in spontaneous offenders. His mother's role was equally perplexing. Although she denied participation in the crimes, her willingness to conceal incriminating evidence indicated a profound level of loyalty, perhaps even fear. Investigators suspected that she believed protecting her son was more important than cooperating with law enforcement, regardless of the brutality of the crimes. Her statements to the court were inconsistent, oscillating between denial, minimization, and insistence that everything was part of a wider conspiracy. The conspiracy narrative became the foundation of Lelo's own defense strategy. He claimed that he had been framed, kidnapped, drugged, and forced to cross borders. He stated that police officers had planted evidence, fabricated testimony, and manipulated witnesses. But despite his elaborate story, he could not provide factual support. Every alleged detail contradicted physical evidence, and many of his statements were proven false within minutes of investigation. His behavior in the courtroom revealed traits that psychologists often associate with individuals who lack emotional empathy. During testimony, he alternated between calm confidence and theatrical displays of frustration. He appeared cheerful when recounting events that should have evoked remorse. At times, he smiled as he described interactions with investigators, as if he were reliving the thrill of manipulation rather than expressing fear or regret. These characteristics raised concerns that his motivations may have been rooted in a form of psychological gratification, though no definitive diagnosis was made. The broader societal impact of the case was significant. Communities in Lesotho and South Africa were left shaken. Parents began escorting children to school. Rural families installed locks and reinforced doors, and public distrust toward law enforcement intensified. Many residents blamed the initial delays in Moholobela's investigation for Camelo's death. Others demanded reforms to prison security after Lelo's escape exposed weaknesses that had remained hidden for years. Political figures attempted to restore public confidence, but their conflicting statements only deepened suspicion. When a government official falsely claimed that Lelo had been recaptured in Cape Town, citizens felt deceived. Investigations into prison staff reignited debates about corruption, underfunded institutions, and the vulnerability of communities when violent offenders exploit these weaknesses. The case also triggered discussions about mental health access across the region. Experts emphasize that many individuals who eventually commit violent crimes show early signs of psychological instability, yet receive no formal assessment or treatment. Lelo's behavioral patterns, social withdrawal, fluctuating mood, obsessive interests, and difficulty maintaining stable relationships were visible long before the killings, but were dismissed as normal eccentricities. When investigators revisited his childhood, they discovered a history of instability. His parents' separation, the absence of consistent supervision, and his struggle to form connections outside the household were noted repeatedly. None of these factors directly explain the brutality of the crimes, but they highlighted the systemic gaps in support that often precede violent incidents. After the trial, families of both victims continued to grieve. Moholobela's parents described a lingering sense of disbelief, a refusal to accept that a child who left home for school could be taken so violently. Camelo's relatives expressed equal anguish, struggling to understand how his final days were marked by confusion, betrayal, and pain. Their testimonies underscored the long-term emotional devastation left in the wake of such crimes. Although justice had been served legally, the sense of closure remained incomplete. Some community members still believed in the possibility of a ritualistic motive. Others continued to fear that Lelo was not the sole participant. A smaller group believed his claims of conspiracy, insisting that more powerful individuals might have influenced the events. None of these theories were proven, but they reflected the psychological wounds still present within the community. The legacy of the case ultimately raised a question that remains unresolved. How can a society protect itself when violence emerges from motives that cannot be fully understood? In many criminal cases, motives such as jealousy, revenge, financial pressure, or emotional conflict provide a clear narrative. But when motives remain ambiguous, unpredictable, or irrational, communities struggle to comprehend what exactly they must guard against. In the years following the verdict, Lesotho and South Africa implemented new safety initiatives, including improved coordination between police departments, increased monitoring of border crossings, and reforms aimed at reducing corruption in correctional facilities. While these measures demonstrated progress, many residents continued to question whether they were sufficient to prevent the next tragedy. Even now, experts continue to debate whether Lelo's crimes were rooted in mental illness, narcissistic predation, or ideological influence. But regardless of motive, the consequences were unequivocal. 2 young lives were taken, 2 families were devastated, and 2 nations were left grappling with the broader implications. The story remains a cautionary reminder of how unpredictable human behavior can be, especially when individual motives diverge sharply from societal norms. It highlights the importance of early intervention, community vigilance, and accountability within institutions tasked with public safety. And above all, it leaves an unsettling question hanging in the air. When someone chooses to kill, not out of necessity, anger, or jealousy, but simply because they can, how do we recognize the danger before it happens? Justice, when it finally arrived in the case of Lelo Holo Scott, was neither swift nor simple. It emerged from years of uncertainty, legal stalling, extradition battles, and a community whose trust in the system had been deeply fractured. Yet justice did arrive. It arrived in the form of 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that Lelo would never again walk freely among the public. It arrived through the conviction of his mother, whose attempts to conceal the truth only prolonged the suffering of 2 grieving families. And it arrived through the perseverance of investigators who continued searching long after many believed the case would fade into silence. Still, legal resolution does not erase the trauma left behind. The families of Moholobela Selo and Camelo Moha must live with the permanent absence of sons who had futures ahead of them, dreams waiting to unfold, and lives that should have extended far beyond the violent final hours they endured. Their grief is not measured in years, but in milestones forever missed, birthdays that will never be celebrated, achievements that will never be reached, and memories that remain painfully incomplete. Their loss exists in a space that the court cannot fill. The broader community, too, carries a wound. The case exposed vulnerabilities in multiple institutions, from investigative procedures to correctional oversight. A single escape from custody revealed the fragility of security measures that citizens assumed were reliable. It forced two nations to confront the uncomfortable truth that dangerous individuals can exploit systemic weaknesses, reinvent themselves, and hide in plain sight. The aftermath inspired reforms, but it also reminded citizens that vigilance is a shared responsibility, not a privilege delegated solely to law enforcement. Beyond the facts of the case, the story raises a deeper question. How can society protect itself from offenders whose motives defy conventional understanding? Lelo's crimes did not align with clear patterns of revenge, financial gain, or interpersonal conflict. Instead, the violence appeared to emerge from a distorted internal landscape, a place shaped by secrecy, compulsion, and an appetite for control that escalated into unspeakable acts. When motives are opaque, communities struggle to recognize early warning signs, and systems fail to intervene before irreversible harm occurs. The legacy of this case is therefore twofold. It is a reminder of the devastating cost of violence, and it is a call to strengthen the mechanisms that safeguard the most vulnerable. It urges institutions to remain accountable, to prioritize mental health assessment, and to ensure that failures of security are addressed decisively rather than ignored. And above all, it emphasizes the importance of remembering the victims not as symbols of tragedy, but as individuals whose lives held value far beyond the brutality that ended them. As we close this story, we honor the memory of two young victims and acknowledge the resilience of the families who fought for the truth. Their pursuit of justice is a testament to the idea that even in the aftermath of unimaginable darkness, the pursuit of accountability remains essential. Thank you for watching this case breakdown. If you value detailed and respectful true crime storytelling, feel free to subscribe and join us for future episodes as we continue examining the cases that challenge our understanding of crime, justice, and human behavior.